The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the field was still mud. Thick, dark mud that clung to boots and made every step a struggle. August 1944, somewhere in northern France, and the war had moved on. The guns were firing miles away now, toward the east, toward Germany. But here, in this muddy field behind the lines, the war's debris remained. 200 German prisoners sat with their hands on their heads. They were dirty, exhausted, defeated. Most were young, barely 20. A few were older, veterans who'd seen too much. They sat in rows under the grey sky, guarded by British soldiers who looked almost as tired as they did. Captain Richard Ashworth walked between the rows with a clipboard and a translator. Ashworth was 32, an intelligence officer with the British Second Army. He'd been doing this for weeks now, asking the same questions, getting the same answers, unit designations, officer names, where they'd been positioned, how many tanks they'd seen. Routine work, necessary work, but routine. Then he came to the German sergeant. The man was older than most of the others, mid-30s maybe. His uniform was torn and covered in mud, but underneath the dirt, Ashworth could see the marks of a professional soldier. Good posture, despite the exhaustion. Steady eyes. This one had been fighting for a long time. Ashworth asked the standard questions in German. The sergeant answered in English, perfect English, barely an accent.
"You speak English well," Ashworth said, surprised. "I worked in London before the war," the sergeant replied. His name was Müller. He didn't give a first name. "I was a waiter in Piccadilly for 3 years." Ashworth made a note. Then he asked where Müller's unit had been positioned. "We were set up to defend against the British advance," Müller said. "North of the road, good position, concrete fortifications. We had 28 men." "And when did you abandon the position?" Müller hesitated, just for a second, but Ashworth noticed it. The sergeant looked at his hands, then back at Ashworth. "We didn't abandon it," he said quietly. "Half the company left during the night. They slipped away before the attack came." Ashworth stopped writing. Desertion was common enough in August of 1944. The German army was breaking apart. Men were running rather than dying for a cause they knew was lost.
But there was something in the way Müller said it. Something that didn't fit the pattern. "Why?" Ashworth asked. "Were they planning to surrender?" "No," Müller said. He looked directly at Ashworth now. "They left because they heard the Canadians were coming." Ashworth stared at him. "Say that again?" "We were told at 1800 hours that the British sector was being taken over by Canadian units. The attack was scheduled for dawn. By midnight, 14 men had disappeared. Just gone. They preferred to take their chances running than to face the Canadians." Ashworth wrote this down carefully, word for word. Then he asked the question he already knew was pointless. "You're saying they were more afraid of Canadians than British troops?" Müller nodded. "Everyone is," he said simply. Captain Ashworth spent the next 2 hours questioning other prisoners from different units. He didn't mention what Müller had told him. He just asked the questions and listened to the answers. The answers were consistent. A corporal from the 716th Infantry Division said his platoon commander had requested transfer when he heard Canadians were moving into their sector. A lieutenant from a panzer unit said his men called the Canadians Die Teufel, the devils, and would rather fight Americans or British if given the choice. An older soldier, a veteran of the Eastern Front, said fighting Canadians reminded him of fighting the Russians. They didn't stop. They didn't take prisoners. They just kept coming. By the time the sun started setting, Ashworth had interviewed 23 prisoners from 7 different units. 19 of them, without prompting, had mentioned fear of Canadian forces. 15 said they would rather face British or American troops. 8 mentioned specific incidents of Canadian aggression that had nothing to do with normal combat. Ashworth sat in his tent that night and wrote his report. He was a careful man, trained to be skeptical of enemy statements. Prisoners lied, they exaggerated, they told interrogators what they thought the interrogators wanted to hear. But this wasn't exaggeration, this was something else. These men were genuinely afraid, and that made Ashworth afraid too because he didn't understand it. The British had been fighting Germany since 1939. 5 years of war, 5 years of blood. The Canadians had only arrived in force in 1943. They were good troops, everyone knew that. But better than the British, more feared than the British. It didn't make sense, unless it did. Ashworth signed his report and sent it up the chain of command. He thought it would get filed away with 1,000 other intelligence summaries, read by staff officers who would nod and forget it. He was wrong. 3 days later, his report reached the intelligence section at 21st Army Group Headquarters. A major, sorting through routine summaries, stopped when he read the prisoner statements. He flagged it as significant and sent it directly to the Field Marshal's desk. By that evening, it sat among 16 other similar reports that had arrived over the past 3 weeks. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery sat in his command caravan reading reports. It was early September 1944. The breakout from Normandy was complete. The German army in France was shattered. Paris was liberated. The Allies were advancing toward Belgium, toward the German border, toward victory. Montgomery was 57 years old, thin, precise, confident. He wore his black beret and carried himself with absolute certainty in his own judgment. He'd commanded British forces through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and now France. He'd defeated Rommel. He'd planned the D-Day landings. He was, by any measure, one of the most successful British commanders of the war, and he knew it. But Montgomery had one quality that kept him from becoming insufferable. He respected intelligence, he read reports carefully, he paid attention to details that other commanders might dismiss, and when the intelligence contradicted what he believed, he didn't ignore it. He investigated. The report from Captain Ashworth landed on Montgomery's desk, along with 16 other similar reports from different intelligence officers, all saying, essentially, the same thing. German prisoners feared Canadian troops more than British troops. Montgomery read all 17 reports twice. Then he pulled out captured German documents from the past 3 months, orders, after-action reports, intelligence summaries. He spent 4 hours going through them with his staff. The pattern was undeniable. German commanders positioned their best troops against expected Canadian attacks. German units requested reinforcement when facing Canadian divisions. German intelligence reports described Canadian tactics as reminiscent of Eastern Front brutality and showing disregard for casualties unusual in Western Allied forces. One report, captured from a German division headquarters, was particularly specific. It recommended that units facing Canadians should expect close-quarters combat, prepare for attacks that continue despite heavy losses, and not assume enemy will respect traditional rules of engagement regarding prisoners. Montgomery sat back in his chair and looked at the documents spread across his desk. Outside his caravan, he could hear the sounds of the headquarters camp. Generators humming, officers talking, the distant rumble of artillery. He thought about what these reports meant. The British Army had been at war for 5 years. British troops had fought across North Africa, through Sicily and Italy, across the beaches of Normandy. They had earned respect through professional competence, careful planning, and disciplined execution. Montgomery had built his reputation on exactly those qualities. The Canadian forces under his command had only been engaged in major operations since mid-1943. Barely a year of serious fighting. Yet somehow in that year they had developed a reputation that exceeded the British in one specific way. German soldiers were more afraid of them. That bothered Montgomery, not because of wounded pride, though there was some of that, but because it suggested something about how wars are fought and won, something that challenged assumptions Montgomery had held throughout his career. He called for his chief intelligence officer. "Summon a staff meeting," Montgomery said. "Tomorrow morning, 0800. I want division commanders, senior staff, and General Simons." "All of them, sir?" All of them. We need to discuss Canadian operations." The officer saluted and left. Montgomery turned back to the reports. He read Captain Ashworth's interview with Sergeant Muller again, paying particular attention to one line. They preferred to take their chances running than to face the Canadians. 14 German soldiers had deserted rather than fight Canadians, experienced soldiers, men who'd survived years of combat. They had chosen to run, to risk execution for desertion, rather than stay and face troops they knew were coming. What created that level of fear? Montgomery wanted to know. He needed to know, because if he didn't understand it, he couldn't use it properly, and Montgomery intended to use every advantage he had to end this war. The meeting room was crowded. Montgomery stood at the head of the table with maps behind him showing the current front lines. To his right sat Major General Roberts, commanding a British armoured division. To his left, 3 other British division commanders. The intelligence staff stood along the wall, and at the far end of the table sat Lieutenant General Guy Granville Simons. Simons was 41 years old, 15 years younger than Montgomery. He commanded the 1st Canadian Army, which, despite its name, was actually a mixed force of Canadian, British and Polish divisions. Simons was tall, serious, with penetrating eyes that missed nothing. He had a reputation as a brilliant tactical innovator and a difficult subordinate. He didn't suffer fools, and he didn't pretend to respect people he didn't respect. Montgomery respected him. That was rare for Montgomery. "Gentlemen," Montgomery began, "we're here to discuss an intelligence matter that has operational implications." He nodded to his intelligence officer, who stood and began distributing copies of the prisoner interrogation reports. "Over the past month, we've conducted extensive interviews with German prisoners from multiple sectors. A pattern has emerged that requires our attention." Montgomery let them read for 2 minutes. He watched their faces, confusion at first, then surprise, then discomfort. Roberts, the British armoured commander, spoke first. "Sir, is this confirmed? German soldiers deserting rather than face Canadian forces?" "Multiple confirmed instances," the intelligence officer replied. "Not isolated incidents, a pattern across different units, different sectors, different time periods." One of the other British commanders shook his head. "Propaganda. Jerry is playing games with us." "That was my first thought as well," Montgomery said. "But look at the captured German documents." They turned the pages. A German intelligence summary from early August, written for internal Wehrmacht use. It described Canadian tactical methods and recommended countermeasures. The language was clinical, professional, not propaganda, just analysis. Canadian units employ aggressive offensive tactics with minimal preliminary bombardment, maximizing surprise. They maintain forward momentum even when suffering heavy casualties. Close quarters combat should be expected. Traditional Western Allied restraint regarding prisoners and wounded should not be assumed. The room was quiet. Simons, who had been reading silently, looked up. "You brought me here to ask why German soldiers are afraid of my troops." It wasn't a question. Montgomery nodded. "I brought you here to understand it. The British Army has been fighting Germany since 1939. Canadian forces have been heavily engaged for barely a year. Yet the evidence suggests German soldiers would rather fight us than you. I need to understand why." Simons sat back in his chair. His face showed nothing, but Montgomery could see him thinking, choosing his words carefully. "May I speak frankly?" "Please." "My soldiers fight differently than yours," Simons said. "Not better, not worse, differently, and the Germans recognize that difference." One of the British commanders bristled. "Are you suggesting British troops lack aggression?" "I'm suggesting British troops fight to defend Britain. They're fighting for their homes, their families, their survival as a nation. That creates a certain approach to combat. Careful, professional, measured." "And Canadian troops?" Montgomery asked quietly. Simons looked directly at Montgomery. My soldiers are volunteers who crossed an ocean to be here. They're not defending Canada. Germany isn't bombing Toronto or Vancouver. These men chose to come here. They chose to fight. That creates different soldiers. How so? Men who choose to fight, who travel thousands of miles to be in a war, fight differently than men defending their homeland. They're more aggressive because they have to justify the choice they made. They push harder because they came so far. They take more risks because they chose to be at risk. Roberts shook his head. That's a thin psychological distinction. Is it? Simons replied. Your men look at Normandy and see the road home to England. My men look at Normandy and see the place they chose to die, if that's what it takes. Different perspectives create different behaviors. Montgomery had been listening carefully. Now he stood and walked to the map behind him. Different behaviors, he said slowly. Let's examine that. He turned to the intelligence officer. Review for the group the operations where Canadian forces have been primarily engaged since Sicily. The intelligence officer consulted his notes. Sicily, July 1943. Canadian divisions pushed through the center of the island while British forces advanced along the coast. Heavy fighting at Leon Forte, Aguirre, Regalbuto. Canadian casualties were high, but advance continued at faster pace than British coastal advance. Italy, Montgomery prompted. Multiple engagements through fall and winter 1943, most notably Ortona in December, month-long urban combat. Canadian forces fought building to building against German paratroopers. Casualty rate approached 60% in some units. Germans eventually withdrew. Normandy. D-Day, June 6th. Canadian forces at Juno Beach achieved deepest penetration of any Allied landing force on D-Day, reaching objectives scheduled for D+2. Subsequent operations around Caen involved heavy casualties but consistent forward pressure against elite SS Panzer divisions. Montgomery nodded slowly. He pulled out another document. And this is from German intelligence, a report written in December 1943, after Ortona, he read aloud. Canadian tactical methods at Ortona resemble fighting on the Eastern Front rather than typical Western Allied operations. Troops demonstrate willingness to accept casualties that would cause other Allied formations to halt and consolidate. Aggressive close-quarters tactics, liberal use of grenades and explosives in urban terrain. Units continue attacks even when reduced to minimal effective strength. Recommend treating Canadian forces as equivalent threat level to Soviet Guards divisions. The room was silent again. Comparing Allied troops to Soviet forces was not a compliment in the usual sense. The Red Army was known for mass attacks, human wave tactics, and acceptance of horrific casualties, but it was effective. They're saying we fight like Russians, one commander asked uncertainly. Montgomery looked at Simons. They're saying you fight like Germans did in 1940. Fast, aggressive, willing to accept casualties to maintain momentum, not slowed down by the careful planning that characterizes British operations. Simons met his gaze. And is that a criticism, Field Marshal? Montgomery was quiet for a long moment. Everyone in the room waited. No, he said finally. It's an observation and it's a question. He walked back to the table and sat down. Germans fear Canadians because Canadians fight the way Germans themselves fought early in the war. That style of warfare brought Germany tremendous success in 1940 and 1941. Poland, France, the Balkans, early victories in Russia, all achieved through exactly the kind of aggressive, forward momentum tactics you've employed. He paused. But that same approach cost Germany massive casualties when the tide turned, at Stalingrad, in North Africa. When aggression met prepared defenses and superior numbers, the losses became unsustainable. Simons leaned forward. What's your question, sir? Montgomery looked at him directly. My question is whether Canadian aggression is helping us win the long war ahead or whether it will cost your forces too much, because I need to know how to use you, and I can't make that decision without understanding what I'm looking at." The British commanders shifted uncomfortably. This was frank strategic discussion that Montgomery rarely had in front of junior officers. But he wanted Simons to hear it, wanted him to understand that Montgomery was taking this seriously. Simons didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the reports spread across the table. When he spoke, his voice was measured. "You want to know if my methods are sustainable?" "Yes." The honest answer is, "I don't know. We've been fighting major operations for 14 months. We've taken heavy casualties, but we've achieved our objectives. We've broken through when others stalled." "At what cost?" Simons pulled out a paper from his folder. In Sicily, Canadian casualties were proportionally higher than British casualties for the same operational period. In Italy, the same pattern. In Normandy, we're currently showing casualty rates approximately 30% higher than British forces engaged in similar sectors. Roberts whistled softly. 30%? But we're also advancing faster, breaking through stronger defenses, forcing German commanders to commit their best troops against us, which weakens other sectors. Montgomery nodded slowly. "Walk me through Dieppe. That's where this started, isn't it?" Simon's face tightened. Dieppe was still a painful subject. August 1942, a raid on the heavily defended French port that had turned into a massacre. Nearly 3,000 Canadian casualties in a single day. "Dieppe taught us what doesn't work," Simons said quietly. "Frontal assault on prepared defenses with inadequate fire support. We lost almost an entire brigade in 6 hours. And what did you learn? That if we're going to attack fortified positions, we need to hit hard and keep moving. That stopping to regroup gives the enemy time to reorganize, that casualties are going to happen, and if we stop every time we take losses, we'll never break through." Montgomery studied him. "That's a harsh lesson." It was a harsh teacher. Montgomery stood and walked to the window. Outside, the September sun was breaking through clouds. He turned back to the room. "Gentlemen, I'm going to share my assessment." They waited. "I believe German soldiers fear Canadian troops because they recognize in them the same aggressive spirit that made the Wehrmacht so effective early in the war. That aggressiveness has tactical value. It creates breakthrough capability that careful, methodical British tactics sometimes lack." He paused. "But I also believe that kind of fighting is a double-edged sword. It achieves results quickly, but at high cost. The question we face is how to employ Canadian forces in a way that maximizes their effectiveness while managing the casualty rates." He looked at Simons. "I'm proposing that we use British and Canadian forces according to their different strengths. Canadian divisions for breakthrough operations where aggression and momentum are essential. British divisions for exploitation and holding actions where careful management of resources is the priority." One of the British commanders frowned. "You're saying use the Canadians as shock troops?" "I'm saying use them as what they are. Highly effective assault forces, but not waste them on operations where their particular strengths aren't needed." Simons was quiet for a moment. "That means Canadian casualties will continue to be disproportionately high." "Yes," Montgomery said honestly. "It does. Is that acceptable to you?" The room waited. Simons looked at the map, at the line marking how far they'd come since D-Day. "If it wins the war," he said finally, "it's acceptable. My soldiers didn't cross an ocean to fight safe battles. They came here to win. If that means they take the hard missions, they'll take them." Montgomery nodded. He'd expected that answer. "Thank you, gentlemen. Dismissed." The officers filed out. Simons was the last to leave. At the door, he turned back. "Field Marshal?" "Yes." "You're right about one thing. We do fight like the Germans did early in the war, but there's a difference." "What's that?" "They were fighting for conquest. We're fighting to go home. That makes us more dangerous, not less." He left before Montgomery could respond. Montgomery sat alone, looking at the maps and reports. Outside, the war continued, guns firing, men dying, and somewhere out there, German soldiers were telling each other to be afraid. Montgomery understood now why they were afraid. The question was what he was going to do about it. He picked up a pen and began writing orders for the next operation. First, Canadian Army would lead the assault. British divisions would exploit the breakthrough. He was going to use his weapon, even if the weapon was more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. The reports kept coming. Through late September and into October, Montgomery's intelligence staff compiled prisoner interrogations, captured documents, intercepted communications. What had started as a curious pattern became undeniable reality. German soldiers were requesting transfer out of sectors facing Canadian forces. German commanders were filing reports describing Canadian tactics as unbridled and showing Eastern Front characteristics. And most telling, German prisoners were asking specifically and repeatedly to be handed over to British custody rather than Canadian. That last detail troubled Montgomery more than anything else. He called in Captain Ashworth, the intelligence officer who'd first documented the pattern. Ashworth arrived, looking nervous. He was just a captain, after all, being summoned by the Army Group commander. "Sit down," Montgomery said. "Tell me about the prisoner requests." The Ashworth opened his folder. "We've documented 47 instances in the past 6 weeks, sir. German prisoners, after being captured by Canadian forces, specifically requesting transfer to British custody. When asked why, the answers are consistent." "What do they say?" "They say they're afraid of being shot." Montgomery leaned back. "By Canadians?" "Yes, sir. They believe Canadian forces are more likely to execute prisoners during the confusion of combat. Multiple prisoners have described incidents where they witnessed or heard about Germans attempting to surrender being shot by Canadian troops. Do we have confirmation?" Ashworth hesitated. "Some, sir. British liaison officers attached to Canadian units have filed reports. Nothing official, but the observations are there." "Show me." Ashworth pulled out another folder. After-action reports, daily summaries, routine paperwork. Buried in the mundane details were disturbing notes. A British captain attached to a Canadian battalion near Caen observed Canadian soldiers firing on 3 Germans attempting to surrender. Platoon leader made no effort to intervene. A British liaison officer during fighting around Falaise. Canadian troops brought back no prisoners from clearing operation. When questioned, sergeants stated they didn't have time to deal with them. A British medical officer treated German wounded who'd been shot after surrendering. Wounds consistent with execution at close range. Montgomery read through a dozen such reports. "How widespread is this?" he asked. "Impossible to say with certainty, sir, but it's not isolated incidents. The pattern exists across multiple Canadian divisions." Montgomery was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you, Captain. Dismissed." After Ashworth left, Montgomery sat alone with the files. He understood what he was looking at. War crimes, small scale, scattered, but war crimes nonetheless. Violations of the Geneva Conventions. And he understood something else. These violations were part of what made Canadian forces so effective. The fear they generated wasn't just about aggressive tactics. It was about a belief that Canadians didn't play by the rules, that surrendering to them was dangerous. That fear was a tactical advantage. Montgomery had spent his career building armies based on discipline and adherence to the laws of war. He believed in those principles. But he also believed in winning, and the evidence suggested that Canadian disregard for some of those principles was helping them win faster. He made a decision. He would not investigate these incidents. He would not discipline Canadian forces. He would not even mention them to Simons unless forced to. Instead, he would use them, because that's what commanders did. They used every advantage, even the uncomfortable ones. The meeting happened 3 days later. Simons had requested it, saying he needed to discuss operational assignments, But Montgomery knew it was really about the reports. Simons wasn't stupid. He had to know that British officers were documenting things. They met alone in Montgomery's caravan. No staff, no witnesses. Simons got straight to the point. My troops are developing a reputation. Yes, Montgomery said. I assume you've seen the reports. I have. Simons leaned forward. Simons bowed. Are you going to order an investigation? Montgomery met his eyes. No. Why not? Because I need you to keep fighting the way you've been fighting, and an investigation would interfere with that. Simons sat back, clearly not expecting that answer. You're saying you're willing to ignore violations of the laws of war? I'm saying, Montgomery replied carefully, that I'm willing to acknowledge the reality of combat in 1944. Your troops are fighting an enemy that has shown no restraint. The SS executed Canadian prisoners in Normandy. Multiple documented incidents. Your men responded. That's regrettable, but understandable. Is it? Do you think it isn't? Simons was quiet. I think my soldiers are fighting harder and more aggressively than British troops. I think that aggressiveness sometimes crosses lines it shouldn't. I think in the heat of combat, some of my troops make decisions that wouldn't pass review in peacetime, and I think expecting perfect discipline under those conditions is unrealistic. So you won't apologize? I won't apologize for my troops fighting harder than yours, Field Marshal. There it was. The challenge. Montgomery could have responded with anger. Could have reminded Simons who was in command. He didn't. I don't want an apology, Montgomery said. I want to understand how to use your forces most effectively, because the evidence suggests you're right. Your troops do fight harder than mine, and that creates both opportunities and problems. What kind of problems? Montgomery pulled out a map. Look at our current dispositions. I have British divisions in relatively quiet sectors, Canadian divisions facing the strongest German positions. That's not an accident. It's because I know you'll attack those positions more aggressively. And the problem? The problem is sustainability. Your casualty rates are 30 to 40% higher than British rates. You're losing experienced soldiers faster than you can replace them. If I keep using you as my primary assault force, you'll be worn down by spring. Simons studied the map. So what's your solution? Operational specialization. I use Canadian forces for breakthrough operations. Sharp, aggressive attacks where momentum is essential. British forces handle exploitation, holding actions, set-piece battles where careful resource management matters. You're saying you want to use us as shock troops. I'm saying I want to use you as what you are, the most effective assault force in this army group, but use you intelligently, not wastefully. Simons traced the front lines with his finger. This means we'll keep taking the hardest missions. Yes. And the highest casualties, but yes. And when British public opinion questions why their boys aren't doing more fighting, you'll tell them what? Montgomery didn't flinch. I'll tell them that different forces have different capabilities, and good commanders use forces according to their strengths. Is that a problem for you? Simons looked at him for a long moment. Not if it wins the war, he said finally. My soldiers didn't cross an ocean to fight easy battles. If taking the hard missions ends it faster, they'll take them. Even at higher casualties? Even at higher casualties, but I have conditions. Which are? First, don't waste us. If you assign my forces to an operation, make sure it matters. Montgomery nodded. Agreed. Second, when we break through, make sure British forces exploit it properly. Agreed. Third, rotation. When we've been in heavy combat, we get pulled back to refit. Montgomery considered this. I can't guarantee equal rotation time. I'm not asking for equal, I'm asking for reasonable. That I can agree to. Simons stood and walked to the map. He looked at it for a long time. You know what you're doing, don't you? he said quietly. What am I doing? You're making a deal with the devil. You're accepting that my troops fight dirty because it's effective. You're positioning us to take casualties so British forces don't have to. You're building your strategy around our reputation for brutality. Yes, Montgomery said simply. I am. And you're comfortable with that? Montgomery stood and joined him at the map. Comfortable? No, but I'm a commander, not a priest. My job is to win this war with the forces I have. Your forces work. They're brutal, they're aggressive, they violate rules they probably shouldn't, but they break through German defenses that stop everyone else. So yes, I'm going to use that. The ends justify the means. In war, sometimes yes, because the alternative to winning is losing, and I've seen what happens when Germany wins. So, if using your aggressive, brutal troops helps end this war faster, then yes, I'll make that trade. Simons was quiet. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. It's the truth, and you deserve to hear it. What about after the war, when people ask questions? Montgomery walked back to his desk. After the war, we'll both write careful memoirs that emphasize heroism while downplaying ugly necessities. That's what commanders do. We carry the weight so our soldiers don't have to. And your conscience? My conscience will manage, because I'll know that every day I shortened this war saved lives. Simons nodded slowly. Then we understand each other. We do. One more thing. The prisoner incidents. I can't stop all of it. Combat is chaos. But I'll make clear to my commanders that unnecessary brutality won't be tolerated. If someone's surrendering properly, we take them prisoner. Can you enforce that? I can make it policy. I can court-martial anyone caught executing prisoners after the fact, but in the heat of battle, I can't promise perfect discipline. I'm not asking for perfect, I'm asking for reasonable. Then you'll get reasonable. They shook hands. An agreement between two men to fight a brutal war using brutal methods, while maintaining just enough restraint to claim they were better than their enemies. Montgomery watched Simons leave, then sat down and poured himself a whiskey. He'd just made a devil's bargain. Using Canadian aggression as a weapon while accepting costs he couldn't fully control, positioning them to take disproportionate casualties, turning a blind eye to violations of the laws of war, all in service of victory. Was it right? Montgomery didn't know, but it was necessary. History could judge him later. The first test came in August 1944 during Operation Totalize. Simons designed it himself, a night attack using armored divisions to break through German lines south of Caen. The plan was innovative, aggressive, risky. Montgomery assigned Canadian divisions to lead the breakthrough. British armored divisions would exploit once the Canadians punched through. The operation launched at midnight. 4 Canadian armored divisions rolled forward in darkness, using radio silence and concentrated force. They hit the German lines with overwhelming violence, bypassing strong points and driving deep. The Germans were stunned. They'd expected careful British-style attack with preliminary bombardment. Instead, they got Canadian armor rolling through their positions in the dark. By dawn, the first defensive line was shattered. Canadian forces had broken through. British divisions moved through the gap and fanned out. The operation worked exactly as planned, but the cost was severe. Canadian armored divisions lost 35% of their tanks in 24 hours. Infantry battalions suffered 40% casualties. British forces, exploiting the breakthrough, lost less than 10%. Montgomery visited Simons 3 days later. "Congratulations," he said, "you broke them." "We broke ourselves doing it," Simons replied. He looked exhausted. "I've got battalions that can barely function. If you ask us to do that again next week, we can't." "I know, you're being pulled back to refit. British divisions will handle the advance from here." "For how long?" 2 weeks. Then I need you for the Scheldt." Simons looked at Montgomery for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not defiance, not yet, but a calculation, a measuring, as if he were deciding how many more times he could accept this. "Understood," he said finally, but his voice carried a weight it hadn't before. Montgomery noticed, but he said nothing. The Scheldt couldn't wait. October 1944 brought rain and the Scheldt campaign. The strategic situation was clear. Antwerp had been captured in September, its port facilities intact. But the port was useless as long as German forces controlled the Scheldt estuary. Without Antwerp, Allied supply lines stretched back to Normandy. The advance was slowing, starved for fuel and ammunition. The Scheldt had to be cleared, and the terrain made it a nightmare. Flooded polders, narrow causeways, concrete fortifications prepared for years. This wasn't open country. This was close-quarters infantry fighting in the worst conditions imaginable. Montgomery assigned the operation to 1st Canadian Army. He knew what he was asking. The reports came in daily: brutal, grinding combat. Canadian infantry wading through waist-deep water to assault bunkers, casualties mounting relentlessly. One report stayed with Montgomery. A Canadian battalion had attacked across a flooded causeway, completely exposed to machine gun fire. They'd lost 60% of their men in 2 hours. The survivors kept advancing, finally overrunning the German positions. 60% casualties. And they'd kept going. That was what Montgomery had built his strategy around. That inhuman willingness to keep moving forward. But reading casualty figures accumulate was different from theory. By mid-November, some Canadian divisions had lost half their strength, battalions down to 300 men, tank regiments cannibalized, and still they fought. What Montgomery didn't realize yet was the vicious irony his strategy had created. A captured German operations order, dated October 1944, made it explicit. When Canadian divisions are identified in sector, commit panzer reserves immediately. Do not wait for breakthrough. Canadian attacks must be stopped at all costs with maximum available force. The order was brilliant German defensive doctrine, but it created a feedback loop. Canadian forces, because of their reputation, now faced the strongest German units every time they attacked. The 12th SS Panzer, Panzerlehr. The elite formations Germany was desperately trying to preserve, which meant Canadian casualties climbed even higher, which reinforced the pattern, which made German commanders even more likely to commit their best troops against them. Montgomery's intelligence officer brought him the captured order. "Sir, the Germans are concentrating their strongest forces against Canadian sectors. They're leaving weaker units to face British divisions." Montgomery read it twice. "Does General Simons know about this?" "Not yet, sir." "Don't tell him. Not yet." Because if Simons knew that Canadian casualties were high, partly because German command was specifically targeting his forces with elite units, the already tense relationship would fracture completely. Montgomery filed the order away. Another truth to carry, another weight to bear. The necessary calculations of command. By late November, the Scheldt was cleared. Canadian forces had paid for it in blood. Some divisions at 50% strength, but Antwerp's port was open, supply lines shortened. The advance could continue. Montgomery received a message from London. The War Office was concerned about Canadian casualties. Questions were being asked in Parliament. Montgomery drafted a careful response. Different forces employed according to capabilities, operational necessities, the vital importance of clearing the Scheldt. He didn't mention that he was deliberately using Canadian aggression as a weapon, that he was accepting their casualties to spare British lives. You didn't put things like that in official communications. But Guy Simons knew. And in February 1945, Simons had finally had enough. The meeting happened in a small headquarters building near the German border. Montgomery had called it to discuss the Rhineland campaign, a massive offensive to clear German forces west of the Rhine River. Montgomery's initial plan assigned Canadian divisions the main attack through the most heavily defended sector. British divisions would advance through less contested areas, then exploit once the Canadians broke through. It was the same pattern they'd used for months, but when Montgomery presented the plan, Simons didn't nod and agree. He stood up. "No," Simons said. The room went quiet. Officers didn't say no to Field Marshal Montgomery. Montgomery looked at him. "Explain." "My forces have borne the brunt of heavy fighting for 6 months. The Scheldt, the winter battles. We've taken casualties that would have broken other formations. My divisions are exhausted, under strength, barely combat effective, and you want to assign us the hardest mission again. Canadian forces are best suited for breakthrough attacks. We've also proven we can be bled white doing it. When does it end? When do British divisions take the hard missions? When do my troops get to be in reserve while yours do the dying?" Montgomery felt his jaw tighten. "General Simons, I understand your concerns, but—" "Do you?" Simons interrupted. He walked to the map and pointed. "Show me one operation in the last 6 months where British forces took the primary assault role. Just one." Montgomery said nothing. "You can't, because you've been using us as a battering ram while preserving British forces, and now you want to do it again. I've been using forces according to their capabilities." "No," Simon's voice was hard. "You've been using us because we'll accept missions that British commanders would refuse, because my troops won't quit even when they should. That's not capability, that's exploitation." The other officers looked uncomfortable. This was subordinate challenging commander. Montgomery stood. For a moment, the two men faced each other. "You're out of line, General." "Am I? Then court-martial me or relieve me and find someone else willing to watch his divisions destroyed while British forces wait in reserve." Montgomery felt anger rising. He'd given Simons more latitude than any other subordinate. But then Montgomery looked at the casualty reports on the table. Canadian divisions at 50, 60% of authorized strength. British divisions mostly at 80 to 90%. The numbers didn't lie. He'd been using the Canadians harder than his own troops. Deliberately, systematically, and Simons was right to call him on it. Montgomery sat back down. "Clear the room," he said quietly. The staff officers filed out. When the door closed, Montgomery and Simons were alone. "You're right," Montgomery said. Simons looked surprised. "What?" "You're right. I've been using Canadian forces disproportionately, assigning the hardest missions to your divisions while managing British casualties more carefully. It's been deliberate policy." "And you're admitting it." "I'm 60 years old, General. I know how to lie to myself, but the numbers are there. Canadian divisions have suffered 40% higher casualties than British divisions under my command. That's not operational necessity. That's calculated decision-making." Simons sat down slowly. "Why?" Montgomery poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to Simons. "Because British public opinion won't tolerate heavy casualties anymore. We've been fighting since 1939. 5.5 years. The country's exhausted. Every death makes headlines. I'm under constant pressure to minimize British losses. And Canadian losses don't matter. They matter less politically. Canada is farther from the fighting. Canadian newspapers don't have reporters at every headquarters. So yes, I've had more political room to accept Canadian casualties than British ones. That's monstrous. It's reality. I'm operating within political constraints, and those constraints mean I preserve British lives when I can, and spend Canadian lives when I must." Simons drank his whiskey. "I could report this. This conversation would ruin you." "You could," Montgomery agreed, but you won't, because you understand the same reality. This war needs to end. And it ends faster when we use the most aggressive forces for the hardest missions. That's been your troops. Despite the cost, it's worked. Is that supposed to justify it? No, nothing justifies it, but it explains it. Montgomery leaned forward. Here's what I'll offer. For the Rhineland operation, I'll revise the plan. British divisions will share the main attack burden equally with Canadian forces. And after that we're close to the end. Germany's collapsing. There may not be many more operations like the Scheldt. Simons studied him. You're asking me to trust you. I'm asking you to accept reality. I've used your forces hard, too hard, I know that, but we're in the final phase, a few more months and it's over. And then what? After the war, when people ask about casualty rates? Montgomery set down his glass. After the war, I'll write memoirs praising Canadian courage. I'll be diplomatic. What I won't do is explain that I used your forces as shock troops to spare British casualties. That truth stays in this room. Living with that doesn't bother you? It bothers me immensely, but I'll carry it. That's what command means, making decisions that keep you awake at night. Simons was quiet for a long time. If you'd told me this honestly 6 months ago, I would have respected it more. 6 months ago, I wasn't sure you'd understand. Now I know you do, because we're both covered in the same dirt. Yes. Simons stood and walked to the window. February rain was falling. Revise the plan, he said finally. Give British divisions an equal share. My forces will participate, but not alone. Agreed. And when this is over, you write whatever memoirs you want, but I'm writing mine too, and I'm telling the truth about what we did. Montgomery nodded. That's your right. One more thing, the prisoner incidents. After the war, if investigations happen, you don't throw my troops under the bus. If there's accountability, it starts with us. Agreed. Simons turned from the window. Then we have an understanding. They shook hands. Not a bargain between commander and subordinate, an acknowledgement between two men who'd made terrible decisions and would live with them forever. The Rhineland campaign launched in late February. British and Canadian divisions attacked together, sharing the burden as Montgomery had promised. The fighting was intense but brief. German forces, exhausted and outmatched, collapsed faster than expected. By March, Allied forces were across the Rhine, by April deep into Germany. In early May, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Montgomery stood at headquarters on May the 8th, 5E Day, watching celebrations, soldiers cheering, dancing, drinking, the joy of men who'd survived and could finally go home. He thought about the cost. 42,000 Canadian dead under his command, 15% of total 21st Army Group casualties from a force that represented 10% of strength. He'd spent Canadian lives to win the war faster, to spare British casualties, to satisfy political pressures. Had it been worth it? The war was won. Germany defeated, the camps liberated, millions saved by ending it when they did. But those 42,000 Canadians were still dead. A week later, Montgomery met with Simons for the last time before Canadian forces prepared to return home. They met alone. Your men fought magnificently, Montgomery said. They fought brutally, Simons replied. Let's not pretend otherwise. They fought effectively. At terrible cost, Montgomery nodded. 15% of casualties for 10% of force strength. The disparity is even worse than we thought. And you're comfortable with that? No, but I'd make the same decisions again because the alternative was a longer war. Your forces shortened it by their sacrifice. Simons pulled out a folder. German casualty statistics. Want to see something interesting? He spread papers on the table. German units that fought Canadian forces suffered higher casualties than those that fought British forces, 35% higher on average. But look at this ratio. German to Canadian casualties compared to German to British. When Canadian forces attacked, they killed more Germans, but they also died at higher rates. The ratio is less favorable. Montgomery studied the numbers. Success through mutual attrition rather than disproportionate enemy losses. Exactly. We won by being willing to die as much as by being willing to kill. British forces won by killing more efficiently. Different approaches, different costs. Same victory.
Is it? Simons looked at him. Does it matter how we won, or just that